The House on the Cliff. Chapter 21. Quick Work. The Hardy boys glanced over at their father on the cot. To their surprise, they saw that he was smiling. Frank was on the point of asking him what he found in the situation to smile at, when he caught a warning glance. He looked over at the guard. Malloy was not bothering with the prisoners. He was not even looking in their direction. Instead, his head was already beginning to nod, as though he were going to sleep. Snakely had made a poor selection when he thought Malloy would guard well. The man had been up the entire previous night helping bring in the shipment of smuggled goods from Lai Chang's vessel, and he had had no sleep that day. He was very tired. Sleep stole upon him without his being aware of it. Several times he straightened up and rubbed his eyes, but eventually he would bow his head again and give in to the luxury of a little doze. In the meantime, Mr. Hardy was busy. He had profited by his previous experience. When the smugglers seized him and attempted to tie him to the bed for the second time, he had made use of a trick frequently employed by magicians and professionals, escape artists, who guarantee to escape from ropes and straitjackets. He had expanded his chest and held his muscles rigid, keeping his arms as far away from his sides as possible, so that later, when he relaxed, he found that the ropes did not bind him as tightly as the captors had intended. This gave him a small leeway. He found that the ropes were especially slack about his right wrist, so he began to work laboriously to free himself. For a long time he thought it would be impossible, and the rope chafed his wrist. But at last he managed to slide his hand free. Joe and Frank watched this performance with amazement, and new hope came into their eyes as they saw their father slowly groping for one of the knots. The detective fumbled at it for a while. It was slow work, for he had but one hand free, but in their haste the smugglers had not tied the knot as firmly as they should, and before long Fenton Hardy had loosened it to such an extent that soon the ends of the rope fell away. His arms were now free, so he braced himself against the side of the bed and struggled to release his feet. They had not been bound so securely, being simply tied down under one strand of the rope about the cot, and after silently struggling for a few minutes, he was able to work his way free. The detective's next move was to take off his boots, which he did swiftly and quietly, placing them noiselessly on the bed. Then he crept out onto the floor and began to steal over towards the guard. Malloy was half asleep, but the detective had not gone more than 2 yards before a slight sound, a slight crackling of the floor, warned the guard that something was amiss. He turned, blinking. A look of intense amazement crossed Malloy's face, and he opened his mouth to yell for help, but Fenton Hardy leapt across the intervening space and hurled himself upon the smuggler before the guard had had time to utter more than a muffled gasp. He clapped one hand over Malloy's mouth and bore the guard to the floor, where they rolled over and over in a desperate and silent struggle. Although Fenton Hardy was weakened by his imprisonment and privation, and although the smuggler was strong, the detective had the advantage of surprise attack, and Malloy had no time to collect his faculties. Joe and Frank watched the battle in an agony of suspense. It was, they knew, their last hope. Fenton Hardy still kept his hand over the other man's mouth, although Malloy was gasping and gurgling and making frantic efforts to call out for help. The detective dug his knee into Malloy's stomach, and when the smuggler tried to wriggle out of the way, he snatched for the revolver. Their hands closed about the butt of the weapon at the same instant. The struggle was short and bitter. Malloy tugged at the revolver, trying to draw it from his pocket. Fenton Hardy dug his knee sharply against the man, and Malloy loosened his grasp with a groan of pain. The detective snatched the revolver free, and then flung himself back, leveling the weapon at Malloy. "Not a word out of you," he whispered. Malloy's hands rose in the air. He did not utter a sound. He was sitting helplessly on the floor, his mouth opening and closing as he painfully drew breath. He was beaten. The detective spied a knife in a leather sheath at the smuggler's belt, so he reached forward and seized the weapon. Then, still keeping Malloy covered with the revolver, he walked slowly backward until he reached Joe's side. Without removing his eyes from the smuggler, Fenton Hardy bent down and sliced at the ropes that bound his son. The knife was sharp, and the ropes soon fell apart. Joe leapt from the chair, casting aside the rope ends, and took the proffered knife. Then, while his father still covered Malloy, he went over to Frank and set him free. Still without saying a word, Fenton Hardy motioned towards the bed and indicated by signs that the smuggler was to lie down on the cot. A gesture of refusal on the part of Malloy was met by a vigorous forward thrust of the revolver, and the smuggler hastily retreated. The ropes on the bed had not been cut, so they were still available for trussing up Malloy, just as Mr. Hardy had been bound. The boys did the job with neatness and dispatch, and they even gagged the smuggler with his own handkerchief and one of the ropes from the chairs. Within 5 minutes, their guard was laying helpless on the bed, bound hand and foot, and gagged so firmly that only a muffle and a subdued muttering escaped him. "What now?" asked Frank in a low tone. "We can't go out by the cove," replied his father. "There are 2 men down there now, signaling to the motorboat. We'd better go upstairs." "Where does that lead to?" "Outside. It will bring us up into the shed near the house." Fenton Hardy moved over towards the door. "We haven't any time to lose," he said. "I have the revolver. If we meet anyone—" He opened the door cautiously and peered outside. There was no one beyond. There was nothing but a flight of steps leading upward into the darkness. The detective went forward, his sons following close at his heels. Step by step they made their way on up in the darkness, for Joe had closed the door behind them, and Frank did not dare making use of the flashlight. At last Fenton Hardy came to a stop. He was fumbling at something immediately above. Then the boy saw a faint opening, which grew larger above them, and the revolver itself into a square of gray light, against which the head and shoulders of their father was fully silhouetted. Fenton Hardy had raised the trap-door that concealed the entrance to the underground caves and passages. Mr. Hardy looked out carefully. There was no sign of smugglers. He proceeded to the very top of the steps, then moved clear of the stairway. Frank and Joe frowned, rising out of the ground like mysterious spirits of the earth, and the 3 stood in the shelter of the shed. It was a dark night, and the trees were moaning in the wind from the sea. Immediately before them rose the gloomy mass of the house on the cliff. There were no lights. In the direction of the lane they could hear dull sounds, no doubt from the truck that the smugglers were loading with goods which were to be disposed of by the man called Burke. "Safe so far," whispered the detective to his sons. They moved out of the shed after closing the trapdoor and stood in the shadows. "We can't go by way of the lane," whispered Frank. "There's a prisoner in the cellar of that house," said Fenton Hardy. "I hate to go without setting him free." "A prisoner?" "I heard them talking about him. Why can't we go to town for help? Once they find us gone, they'll clear out. But 3 of us can't do much against this gang. They'll just capture us all again." The detective considered this for a moment. At last he sighed. "Yes, the risk is too great," he said. "And I've let you take too many risks already. We'd better go back to town." Having arrived At this destination they moved slowly across the grass of the yard, heading towards the bushes that flanked the lane. The great bulk of the old stone house loomed heavily and darkly in the night. Then, suddenly, they heard a hush sound that struck terror into their hearts. The clatter of the trap door being raised. Chapter 22. Into the Haunted House. A hoarse shout came through the darkness. "Chief, Redhead! They've got away! Watch for 'em!" Someone was scrambling through the opening in the shed, bellowing in a frantic voice, warning the other smugglers of the escape. "Into the house!" snapped Fenton Hardy. He began to run swiftly across the yard towards the big, gloomy house. Frank and Joe followed. The men in the shed saw the moving figures. The darkness was pierced by a flash of crimson, and a revolver barked 3 times. From the lane came sounds of running feet. A man was shouting. "What is it? What's the matter?" "They've got away, Hardy and them boys. They've escaped. Look! There they are now, running across the yard." The revolver spoke again, but the shots were wild, for the detective and his sons were soon lost to view in the shadows of the house. With the uproar growing in volume behind them, they fled for the shelter of the building. It was their only refuge. If they attempted to escape to the road, they would be almost certain of meeting some of the smugglers. They could not go back down the passageway. If they retreated, they would be driven to the verge of the cliff. Fenton Hardy sped around to the back door and flung it open. The fugitives raced into the kitchen and closed the door behind them. Out of the darkness came a frightened voice. "Who's there?" It was so sudden and unexpected that their pulses leapt. They made no answer. "Who's there, I say? Is it you, Redhead?" Still they did not reply. Fenton Hardy crept through the darkness in the direction of the voice. "Speak, quick, speak, or I'll fire." The boys heard a sudden, scrambling sound. Their father had thrown himself upon the other man. The boys rushed in on the 2 struggling figures. There was a deafening roar and a streak of flame. The man of the house had been armed with a shotgun, and in the struggle it had exploded. Fortunately, the Hardy boys were not standing in the path of the shot, but the noise had attracted the attention of the smugglers outside the house, and in a few seconds the back door was flung open. "They're in here!" someone yelled. "They're in the house!" Fenton Hardy flung to one side the man with whom he was struggling. "Upstairs!" he called out to the 2 boys, and ran on into the next room. A feeble light was burning, a candle standing in its own grease near the bottom of the staircase. Up these stairs they fled, Joe pausing long enough to extinguish the candle. The room was plunged into darkness just as the first of the smugglers rushed through the doorway, Fenton Hardy waiting at the top of the stairs until the boys joined him. Somebody in the room below lit a match. The detective fired directly at the spluttering light. There was a muttered exclamation. The match was immediately extinguished by the smuggler who had been so incautious as to reveal his whereabouts in this manner. A whispered conversation followed. "He's at the top of the stairs," said one of the smugglers. "We can't rush him. He's got a revolver." "Only one?" "Yes, and the kids aren't armed." "Wait till he uses up his ammunition. Then we'll get him." There was another whispered soliloquy, and then the smugglers apparently withdrew towards the doorway leading into the kitchen. Then in a moment a perfect fusillade of shots broke out. But Fenton Hardy and the boys had withdrawn past the turn in the staircase and were well protected. They could hear the uproar of gunfire as the smugglers riddled the staircases with bullets. "That should have finished 'em," they could hear Snakely saying. "If they're on the stairs at all, They're as dead as mutton by now." "Best be careful," muttered one of the men. "Hardy has a gun." "Where did he get it?" "From the guard. They tied him up." "Lucky they didn't get away altogether. Wait till I talk to Malloy." "He was tied fast to the bed when we came back up the stairs. They had taken his gun and gagged him. He said they had just gone, so we made after them and came up through the trap door. They were just getting out of the shed when we saw him. What a fine chase we would have had if they had got out into the woods." Whispers followed. The boys listened. Once they heard someone say, "The back stairs." Frank turned to his father. "They're going to rush us by the back stairs." "I hadn't thought of that," said Mr. Hardy. "I wonder if there's any way of reaching the attic." Frank took the flashlight from his pocket and switched it on. Just a few yards away he could distinguish a flight of stairs leading up to a trapdoor in the ceiling. At the same time he could hear a stealthy noise at the bottom of another flight of steps that led to the kitchen. "Hurry," he whispered, and the three moved silently down the hall until they reached the steps. Joe went up first, and Frank followed with the light, while Fenton Hardy stood at the bottom of the steps to cover their retreat with the revolver. When Joe reached the trap door, he pushed at it. At first it proved stubborn and would not open. There was an anxious moment while he had to force it open, but in spite of all his efforts, it would not budge. "What's the matter?" asked Frank from below. "It won't open." Frank went up the few remaining steps and added his efforts to those of his brother. Together they shoved at the trap door, and at last it moved. Then opened, falling back with a loud crash. There was a yell from the stairs. "Hurry up, men! They're getting into the attic!" A rush of thudding footsteps followed as the smugglers raced up the steps. Joe scrambled through the opening and Frank followed. Fenton Hardy was only halfway up the steps, however, when the first smugglers reached the hallway. The detective fired directly at them. The smugglers who were in the lead fell back in a desperate attempt to reach cover, and in so doing they collided with those behind them. For a few moments confusion prevailed, and Fenton Hardy took advantage of it to spring up the few remaining steps, scramble through the opening, and fling the trapdoor back into place. The Hardys found themselves in an inky darkness of the attic. Frank switched on the flashlight, and its glare they saw that they were in a dusty chamber immediately below the roof. Old boxes and rubbish lay about. "Where did they go?" they heard one of the smugglers ask. "Into the attic," replied another. "No, we've got them where we want them." "That's what you said last time. They can't get out of there. We've got them cornered." Snakely's voice broke in. "Hardy?" he shouted. Mr. Hardy did not answer. "Listen, Hardy," went on Snakely. "We've give you 1 minute to come down out of there." Still no answer. "The floors are thin, Hardy. We can fire right through 'em. You can't get out. We have you cornered. Better come down." Frank flashed the light from side to side. It was evident that the smugglers spoke the truth. They were indeed cornered. An interval of silence followed. Then came, "Your last chance, Hardy." Frank flashed the light upon his father. Mr. Hardy was inspecting the chamber of the revolver. He held out the weapon with a gesture of despair. There was no more shells. A shot sounded from below, and a bullet ripped its way savagely through the flooring, but a foot or so away from where the three sat. Another bullet tore through the wood of the trap-door. The Hardys sprang back, and making as little noise as possible, pressed themselves against the sloping walls of the attic, keeping as far away from the trap-door as they could. A few more shots resounded. The bullets were unpleasantly close. Then Snakely spoke again. "What do you think of it now, Hardy? Are you and your boys ready to come down?" They did not answer. for they knew that if they did, their voices would reveal where they were standing and might bring a bullet. When they did not reply, Snakely spoke to his men. "Let 'em have a few more." An angry chorus of revolver shots followed. In the midst of the uproar, some of the smugglers secured a long pole and pushed against the trap door with it. Before those above could avert the danger, the trap door was flung wide open. It fell back with a crash. A hand appeared through the trap door, holding a revolver, and then the head and shoulders of one of the smugglers followed. He peered into the darkness, holding the weapon in readiness. Someone had switched on a light in the hall so that the man's figure could be clearly seen. "Come out of it, or I'll shoot." Further resistance was useless. With sinking heart, Frank advanced towards the edge of the opening in the floor, while Joe and Fenton Hardy followed with arms upraised. The smugglers backed his way down the steps, still keeping them covered, until he reached the bottom of the stairs. The Hardys descended, conscious of an array of leveled revolvers that covered every movement. They saw Snakely standing in the forefront of the crowd. They were captured again. Chapter 23. Rescue. Snakely stepped forward. "So," he sneered, "you pretty nearly got away with it, didn't you?" The captives did not answer. They were sick with disappointment. Just when escape had been within their grasp, the smugglers had outwitted them. "You bit off a little more than you could chew when you stacked up against me," bragged Snakely. "What'll we do with them, Chief?" asked one of the men. "Take them back to the cave. We'll get them out to Lai Chang right away. If they get away again, there'll be trouble for you. Keep an eye on them." "Shouldn't we tie them up?" "There's no rope. It doesn't matter. Put a bullet through the first one of them that makes a false move. You hear that?" he said, turning to Fenton Hardy. "The first one that tries to escape gets a bullet through him." The three were surrounded by the smugglers. The light shone on the evil, bearded faces and the glistening of the drawn revolvers. Fenton Hardy's useless weapon had been snatched from him. "Downstairs," snapped Snakely. "Get downstairs with you." He prodded Frank with the barrel of his revolver as he spoke. The Hardy boys moved towards the stairs, their father in the rear. One of the smugglers went ahead in case the prisoners should by chance make some desperate break for freedom. When they reached the lower room, they paused while the man ahead lit a match, the electric light that had been broken. Hardly had the match flared, then there came the sound of thudding feet through the kitchen, and the back door banged noisily. Someone rushed into the room, gasping for breath. The light revealed him to be another of the smugglers. "Police!" he exclaimed in terror. "They're coming down the lane!" A babble of voices followed. The smugglers came tumbling down the stairs in their haste. With one bound, Snakely leapt forward and seized the man by the collar. "What?" he exclaimed. "What's that you say? Police?" "Down the lane," gasped the man. "They came down the road in a car, and they're closing in on the house. I saw 'em." With a yell, Snakely flung the man to one side. "Down into the cave," he roared. "Quick!" Confusion prevailed. In the resulting uproar, the match went out, and the room was plunged into darkness. Frank resolved on a daring plan. He was standing directly beside one of the smugglers, and as soon as the light went out, he sprang at the fellow. Dashing the revolver from his grasp, it clattered on to the floor. "Help!" roared the fellow as they grappled together. Fenton Hardy had soon been watching for his chance, and he sprang through the darkness at Snakely. He collided heavily with the chief of the smugglers, and they rolled on the floor in a desperate struggle. It was impossible to distinguish friend from enemy in the darkness. Joe plunged into the midst of the surging figures, and his fist smashed against the face of one of the smugglers, who gave a howl of pain. Then outside the house another uproar burst forth. Someone was banging on the front door. Men could be heard shouting to one another. Snakely made a desperate effort and managed to get his feet. He struck out with both fists and managed to break free from the detective. He whirled to one side, stumbling out into the kitchen, and then reached the back door. He flung the door open. Almost instantly a dark figure appeared in the doorway. It was the figure of a man in the uniform of a state trooper, with drawn revolver, and Snakely shouted the warning to the smugglers in the other room. "The police!" he roared. "Every man for himself! Make your getaway!" The trooper shot through the doorway at him, but Snakely dodged to one side. There was a rush of footsteps from the other room as the rest of the smugglers raced out into the kitchen. The officers tried to hold them back, but they were too many for him, and he was hurled against the wall. Utter confusion prevailed. The place was in absolute darkness, and out in the yard shots, shouts, and hoarse imprecations mingled in an indescribable uproar. One of the smugglers managed to reach the shed. He flung open the trap door and descended to the steps. Some of his companions followed, and in the darkness and excitement their escape was unnoticed. Half a dozen police officers were in the yard. They had been attracted to the house by the sound of the shots when the Hardys were pursued by the smugglers, and they had planned to surround the place. They would have succeeded in capturing the entire gang had it not been for the man on guard outside. Back in the living room of the house, Frank was still struggling with his antagonist. The man was strong and heavy, a rough-and-tumble fighter, and the boys soon found that he had his hands full. They struggled desperately in the darkness, and the smuggler frantic with fear of capture. Frank grimly resolved that the man should not get away. Fenton Hardy headed towards the door leading into the kitchen. Just then a figure brushed by him. He made a grab for the man, but the fellow evaded him and raced towards the other side of the room. The detective gave chase. The fugitive kicked open a door and ran towards the front of the house. Mr. Hardy could follow him quite easily by the sound of his footsteps. The fugitive scurried into the front room and banged the door behind him. Mr. Hardy launched himself against the door, which had a lock that snapped when the door shut. For a moment he was balked. Then he stepped back a few paces and rushed at the door, plunging against it with his shoulder. The woodwork splintered, another rush, and the door fell open. The detective reeled into the room. His fugitive had disappeared, but the room was faintly lighted, as there was a wide window. In the gloom the detective could see a dark patch in the floor. It was a trapdoor leading evidently to a cellar. He went down through the opening, finding a flight of stairs, which he descended. He could hear footsteps receding through the darkness, but he made his way across the uneven floor of the cellar. The detective stopped and listened. He heard the hurrying footsteps as the smuggler went on to the far end of the cellar. Then, to his great surprise, he heard a voice. In the distance he saw a faint glow of light. Then he saw that the cellar was divided into two parts, and that the fugitive had entered a small room. He crept closer. "What's happening?" he heard someone say in a weak voice. "Everything," snarled a voice, which he recognized as that of Snakely. The detective's heart leapt. "Everything is happening. The police are here." "The police?" "Yes, the police, state troopers, federal officers and all. But don't think you're going to have a chance of squealing on us. I'm going to fix you, as I should have done a long time ago." The other voice rose, replete with terror. "No, no! You wouldn't do that, Snakely! Let me live!" Fenton Hardy crept swiftly over to the door. He saw Snakely standing by a small cot in a cell-like room. On the cot crouched a haggard man whose hands were handcuffed behind him. His feet were shackled to one leg of the iron cot. Snakely, with a grim look of cruelty on his face, was raising a heavy club he had picked up. There was no time to lose. The detective sprang through the doorway. He plunged at Snakely just as the smuggler raised the club to strike. Snakely reeled against the floor, while Fenton Hardy, at his throat. Desperately, the smuggler tried to raise the weapon, but the detective had seized his wrist. They swayed to and fro, stumbled about on the muddy floor. Mr. Hardy had the advantage in that he had taken Snakely by surprise. He pinned the smuggler against the wall, twisted his wrist. The club fell to the floor. Snakely plunged forward, and they lost their footing, rolling about in the mud. Suddenly, Fenton Hardy wrenched his arm free, sprawled over, and managed to seize Snakely's revolver. He pressed it against Snakely's side. The smuggler gave in. He flung his arms above his head. "I'm licked," he muttered sullenly. They got slowly to their feet, Fenton Hardy keeping a watchful eye on the captive. Upstairs they could hear the uproar continuing as the police still gave battle to the smugglers. "Upstairs," snapped the detective. Without taking his eyes off Snakely, he said to the man on the cot, "We'll come back for you later, Mr. Jones."